Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you can hear me fairly clearly. I hope you've enjoyed the show so far. I think the guys over at Reynolds, we are losing our voices over the booth, so hopefully, indeed, you can hear me fairly clearly. The reason Reynolds thought it might be useful to have a talk about materials, I don't know if you're aware, Reynolds has been in the bike industry a number of years. We work in metallic tubing like steel, aluminium, magnesium and titanium, doing it for a number of years. And we have obviously worked on a number of different projects. What we normally do on a talk like this, I'd give a talk for about maybe 20 minutes, 25 minutes. And we are open to questions after that. So if you have got any queries because of something I may have said, we'll happily take questions. So just to say how plan to run that today. One of the main things that Reynolds tends to get as a question, we often get cyclists saying, what's the best material to make a bike frame from? Or another type of question would be we've heard, for example, 953 is stronger than 631. How much stiffer will that frame be? And what I'd like to do at this talk is first talk about strength of materials, and then talk about stiffness, and then try and bring the two factors of strength and stiffness together so that you could see how a frame designer, and basically somebody like yourself who want to buy a frame, would see those mechanical properties of metals being actually applied into a frame. So the first part of the talk, I'm going to concentrate on strength of materials, and I'm going to try not to use too many numbers, but maybe try and talk in a way that isn't too technical. So imagine, for example, something like a stainless steel spoke, and imagine if you cut that stainless steel spoke, what's called the area, the cross-section is about 1 millimeter square. Now, from that 1 millimeter square, we have, if you're looking at strength, the way we measure strength is normally force over area. So it's basically tensile strength, a very important number for an engineer. If you can imagine the steel alloys that would have been around, say, in the 1930s, and in fact, even if your car body, for example, is made out of a steel alloy right now, that spoke, the 1 millimeter cross-section, could withstand maybe something about 30, 35 kilos hanging from it before it broke. That would be a very typical steel alloy. Then you look at Reynolds 531, which actually was brought out in 1935, and I know that some of you here have got frames made from Reynolds 531. At one go, that particular alloy could then take a strain of 70 odd kilos for that same 1 millimeter. So it took the strength out quite far. The next big thing that Reynolds did was Reynolds 753, which was brought out about 1976. That strength then suddenly shot up. And what you're looking at is now like 100 kilos hanging from that bicycle spoke, for example. You know, it shows you just how far up strength had gone. Since then, we brought out Reynolds 853, which goes up to 120 kilos. And now with Reynolds 953, that same strength has gone up to nearly 180 kilos. So what you're seeing is metals developing tensile strength way in advance of anything we had like 100 years ago. And that's part of the reason why, if the strength of material goes up, Reynolds can make a tube that is basically thinner in wall, and that could still be strong. Now that's one of the sides that we're basically looking at, is strength of materials. Just to give you a quick second angle that you need to look at, because for example, some of you all would consider having a frame made in titanium. If you imagine, I said 853, say 120 kilos per square millimeter, you're now looking at titanium which might be 1,000 kilograms per square millimeter. What you probably also know, though, is the density of steel is higher than that of titanium. So one of the other important aspects is think about what is called strength to weight, because that does change depending on what alloy. And for example, aluminium alloys might only stand, for example, 35 kilograms per square millimeter as a strength. So you can see there's quite a few different numbers we take into account. But one of the important things to note then is, depending on the metal that is used in the frame, what is called the strength to weight ratio will change. And generally, the better materials will have very high strength to weight ratios indeed, and that's really what Reynolds are trying to work with. So if we put aside strength for a moment and then move to stiffness. Stiffness is a property where people tend to get a little bit confused about what stiffness actually means. From a technical definition, the value that we would have for a metal, it's called modulus of elasticity, but it basically could be, for example, 200 gigapascals. That's a big number, we don't need to worry too much about that. But I think the important thing is the stiffness of a metal does vary depending on, obviously, how it is shaped. And I want to try and give you 3 examples here in a moment. Some people may recognize this as a chainstay. This is a chainstay that is made from a tube which is 1 inch diameter, it's 25.4 millimeter diameter, and just to mention, it has a 0.7 millimeter wall thickness, and it weighs 150 grams. The reason I mention that is, if you imagine that particular tube there, and we just take a mechanical engineering calculation, say we want to deflect that tube 1 millimeter, we know that unit would be, for example, 100 units just to make that 1 millimeter change. That's our benchmark. What Reynolds could do, or suggest to a designer, is instead of using that 1 inch tube at, let's say, 25.4 diameter, 0.7 millimeter wall, make a tube which is 28.6 millimeter diameter but 0.55 wall. So what you've got is a bigger diameter tube but a thinner wall, which happens to weigh the same weight of 150 grams. But the interesting thing there is, if you imagine that deflection, you would now need something like 120 units of pressure to get that 1 millimeter of deflection. So what it does is, simply by using the same weight of material in a bigger diameter, thinner wall, you now have been able to improve the stiffness of that material, even though the strength has not changed. And then to take it one stage further, as you can imagine, a chainstay is normally oval. And this is a very typical oval we do for some of our customers, where that 25 millimeter tube is now at its thinnest side. It's something like 20 millimeters in width, but its height has gone up to 30 millimeters. The difference now is the same thing. If you want to deflect it 1 millimeter, you now need a force of about 160 units to get it down 1. But on the side, you only need 67 units to make that 1 millimeter change. So you can see, weight has not changed, the shape has changed, but that shaping has changed how much stiffness you get from that tube. And really what we're trying to indicate here is the strength has not changed, it's the shaping of that particular metal that has made the difference. And if we change from, say, titanium to steel, the stiffness would also change. So you can now see that stiffness is a property of the particular metal. And if you remember what we said about strength of materials before, strength to weight ratio changes. One important thing about metals is the stiffness to weight ratio from, say, steel to titanium to magnesium to aluminium. Most people don't realize is when you look at what we call specific stiffness to weight, the ratio does not change. So in other words, theoretically, 1 kilo of aluminium would have the same stiffness as 1 kilo of steel, or 1 kilo of magnesium. It's the way it is shaped that actually changes the stiffness of a frame. So if you now look at what we said about first strength and then stiffness, you can see that if you draw the two mechanical properties together, that is what a frame designer actually needs to know about when they actually build a frame. So then, what Reynolds would basically do when we work with various frame designers, we offer them quite a variety of different tubes, as you know, all the various brands that you may know, like Reynolds 631, 8539, 953, and titanium, for example. If somebody wanted, say, a touring frame, they wouldn't necessarily want a stiff frame, but they would want a strong frame. And what a frame designer could then basically do is have a look at how thick a wall do I need, how big a diameter of tube do I need, and not forgetting, for example, if you want something that is subject to a lot of fatigue load, say heavily loaded touring bikes, for example, they need to think about how big the wells need to be, or how big the walls need to be at the joints. All of that information can be changed by simply selecting different tubes for a particular reason. So if you may remember the original lug bike from the 1960s and 70s with the famous 1-inch top tube, what has happened is you could go to what they call the oversize, where they would have the 1.1 inch top tube, which would actually be stiffer, but because they had actually used thinner walls, the weight of the frame doesn't necessarily have to rise because of that. And one of the other important things, of course, with metals is how is the frame being fabricated? Because a TIG weld, for example, is a very efficient way of joining tubes together, but it requires a lot of care and attention. Sometimes a heat treatment, of course, may be required if it's an aluminium frame, and obviously the thinner the wall, the more and more difficult it is to actually fabricate something like that. So you can see that for any given frame design, as soon as you start deciding what use you have for the frame, in other words, are you going to be a sprinter, are you going to use it for racing, are you going to use it for touring, are you just a track bike, you can actually limit some of these choices and try and get what you want. But when you want something like a very stiff frame, in general, what you're looking for is a frame that deflects the least. One thing that Reynolds tends to find is we do get people say, I really want a stiff frame. Bit of information that we get, for example, I don't know if you know, we also work in the car industry, and we work in the motorcycle racing industry. Reynolds, when we brought in Reynolds 631, which was a much thinner wall tube than some of the tubes they had been using before, our original concern was because the wall is thinner, the motorcycle frame would be less stiff, and we were concerned our customers would think it would not be stiff enough. And interestingly, they made a comment to us is, you've got to be careful, because you could have a frame that is actually too stiff and basically not very responsible, and the performance wouldn't be very predictable on the track. So a lot of the motorcycle racers would actually prefer a frame which is lighter, but they could get feedback from the frame. So the comment is basically, you could actually have a frame design that was actually overly stiff, and as you know yourself, sometimes you can get frames which give you too much feedback from the road and don't make it very comfortable to ride over a full day and say in the saddle. So the comment that I would make is, Reynolds would look for tubing and try and design tubing and provide to our customers something that would be fatigue resistant, but we wouldn't necessarily be looking to go for absolutely high numbers in stiffness, because that's not necessarily what our frame, the people who are actually riding the frames want to use day in, day out when they're riding with them. A carbon frame can be very stiff, and in fact quite often will achieve that kind of value. For some of the metal frames, you have some advantages in terms of tuning the feel like that. I don't know if there are any frame builders, so if they are, it's worth coming to the Reynolds stand because we have some software which models some of this information. In other words, you can change tubing diameters, tubing profiles. We have some software we wrote with Birmingham City University, which is aimed at doing a very simple analysis like that. I mean, that's fairly special stuff, but if you're interested, do talk to us. But what I would say is, do come and ask Reynolds if you have any questions like that. What I'd like to do now is really pass off to anybody in the audience who maybe has some questions about types of metals or any information like that, and I'm happy to try and answer it if I can. Yeah? Okay, first question was, do we see the industry moving towards titanium in the future? I guess like all things, it's difficult to tell. You know that Reynolds have been in the industry for titanium for about 20 years ourselves. Titanium is, I have to say, a very good alloy to use. As you know, the corrosion resistance is excellent. To me, one of the biggest drawbacks of titanium will remain is the price at which we buy the raw material and the amount of cold working we can put into it. You're probably aware Reynolds did do 32.5 titanium and also do 6.4 or did 6.4, which is an alloy we cannot currently get. My feeling is it will remain a niche product. The welding of titanium is not to be ignored. You're probably aware only a few people can weld titanium successfully, and the lightest frames are made by butting titanium like we do, and there are a few guys in the States who do their own version of butting as well. My feeling is it'll remain a niche product because the titanium production costs have not dropped over the last few years, and we see nothing in the industry that says the raw material will drop. I think it will remain as an excellent choice of material, but I cannot see it being mainstream, mainly due to the cost of the material itself. Any other questions? Now, if I understand correctly, you want some recommendations on the types of tubes that you can bend for chainstays and seat stays? And I'm assuming you're talking in steel. Okay. This is a question Reynolds also gets, and our general recommendation is use non-heat treated steels. When Reynolds takes some of its heat treated steels like Reynolds 953 and 853, once the heat treatment's been done, the strength has gone up, but what is called the ductility or elongation has gone down. So generally our recommendation to any of our users is do not try and bend a heat-treated tube. For most applications, something like Reynolds 525 chromoly or Reynolds 631, which is the air hardening steel, which is a cold worked alloy but has not been heat treated, those are generally very good tubes which a number of our users can actually bend. And for example, some guys will actually buy 61 fork blades and rake them themselves. Those normally are very good choices when you want to manipulate it yourself. But as I would say, heat-treated steels, generally we do not recommend you trying to do that because you've already got low ductility, and if you try and bend it, you may get a point where it actually cracks. Okay? Any questions? Okay, that's a good one, I think. Conventional steels versus stainless steels, advantages and disadvantages. Now, this is a difficult one because there are so many choices of good conventional steels, and obviously you can paint a good carbon steel. So, you know, that's always been around and that's still the case. The reason that Reynolds decided to spend time developing the stainless steel, you're probably aware we brought up Reynolds 953 about 4 years ago. The first reason we actually brought that particular alloy into the marketplace was actually first the jump in tensile strength, because I don't know if you're aware and you remember, 953 is roughly 40% stronger than Reynolds 853. So even if it wasn't stainless, it was quite a jump up in technical performance. I'm sure if you talk to a few frame builders around here, 953 is not an easy alloy to work with, as I'm sure you're aware, and I think tool wear and breakage and all that are all part of, frankly, using that particular material. But one of the things that we'd also identified as a theoretical market factor was people who have had steel bikes, even though if they've been well protected, they've always been afraid of rust and what it could do to a frame. And this comment, and quite often you'd see people saying, oh, I've had my frame and finally I gave up on it because it had rusted through the seat tube or the chainstay or whatever. And frankly, over a number of years, you would see that with the carbon steel, even if you protected it. I have to say is I'm aware of people keeping frames 40 and 50 years in 531, still riding them quite happily, not seeing any signs of rust, and you've got to then say conventional seals, if looked after, would do that. Switching to something like 953 and our new 931 and our competitors' products as well in stainless, what I think we are seeing is a combination of higher strength, which theoretically means lower weight of a steel frame, so that's one practical advantage. The saving in weight of paint on some frames, because you could save a quarter of a pound just in paint on a frame, not to be ignored. And I have to say, sometimes the feeling is if you are buying a stainless frame, it's a big investment for a number of people. They put a lot of money down for a frame that's built for them. And it sounds kind of morbid in a way, but the frame will outlast you. It could be handed on to your next generation. And I mean, it genuinely is. I could see the frame, if it's normally cared for, a stainless frame like a titanium frame will be there for a very long time. And I would say, to me, that would be a kind of thing that if I was looking at a frame, admittedly stainless steels require more care in building. I mean, they need slightly different preparation methods and cutting, etc. You could look at a stainless frame as being literally an investment for life. Nice one. Now, I will admit, although it's an ecological material, Reynolds have not actually made any Reynolds bamboo tubes recently or in the past. I have to say that ironically in the Coventry Transport Museum we saw bamboo frames with steel lugs from about 1898 or 1900, so the technology has been around for a long time. I mean, from our perspective though, anybody who is riding a bike in whatever material, as far as I'm concerned, is great for the bike industry. So we're more than happy. And who knows, we might be able to do the lugs on that kind of frame. But whatever, we're happy with the idea. The question is getting, obviously, weights down and stiffness and all the other things. And obviously, how do you engineer that? And it would be a manufactured part rather than an engineered part. But my feeling is, if you like a bamboo bike, go for it. And I'd be certainly happy to ride one myself. It's a good thing my wife's not here. The answer is yes. And by strange coincidence, I assure it is strange coincidence, I've got prototypes of the first 853, which is the first one I really got actively involved with in the States. I've got a prototype aluminium lithium X100. I've got a prototype titanium butted frame, and I've got a prototype 953. So I have to admit I have a few. For what it's worth, I used to ride. I'm not a particularly good rider, but I enjoy riding. And I have to say one thing that I think I enjoy because we're a group of guys out near Coventry in Balsall Common. We go, especially now we notice more people are riding what I call audaxes, cycles sportive, the longer events. What we are seeing is, it's not that by any means we're anti-carbon fiber. Carbon fiber is a great engineering material. But what we do see is the need for what I call a comfortable ride, which is not harsh, and you can ride the bike in many different areas. Up long climbs, down good winding mountain descents, over some pretty rutted roads in England. You want a bike that'll handle all of that. And I have to say, in general, because metals can be shaped in certain ways, you can get a slightly, what I would call springy feel. Within reason, metallic bikes can deliver that kind of performance. Sorry, I'm asking in case there's anybody else.
Thank you very much, Steve.
Okay. Thank you.